From the outside, the gigantic geometric structure looked like it had descended from the skies, from another, more knowledgeable dimension of existence, which was exactly how it was supposed to look. The functionary at the main entrance was on duty with 4 guards, all male Gathkaris, who stood to attention without weapons. Each of the entrances on all sides of the pyramid had a similar affectation of 4 unarmed guards. The functionary was a tall man in a pristine white gown, physically gaunt and full of gravitas, with a voice that boomed so resonantly that it put people in mind of a prophet of past ages. Thus far his hourly requests for civil harmony had fallen somewhat distressingly upon deaf ears, but now the area around the temple seemed to be filling up very rapidly with a boisterous and undisciplined throng of Akrani soldiery. A surly and disquiet bunch, they had brought amphoras of wine and goatskins of beer with them, the strong stuff imported from the south, and they drained off the heady brew in quantity. They showed no decorum or concern for social etiquette, despite being in the vicinity of the holy temple. In fact, some few relieved themselves against it, quaffing their beer and pissing against the sacred stones. A Gathkari accused of desecrating the temple in this manner would most certainly be sent to the crab pits, the form of capital punishment favoured in Gathkar because it was believed not to involve an executioner, and would therefore not stain the soul of anyone but the guilty man. The accused who had been condemned to the crab pits was staked out naked in a pit of giant crabs to be eaten alive, and it was commonly the case that as much as 1/3 of his total body weight might be devoured by the crabs before the man in the pit finally stopped screaming and died. This usually took about 4 hours. As a capital sentence, this also had the virtue of being ecologically sound, but naturally only men who were not honoured guests suffered this punishment. Increasingly, the Akrani numbers around the temple grew until their congregation took on a feeling of menace. Unsupervised by their officers, the Akrani horde had the scent of hostility in its nostrils. The rowdy multitude was transforming into a brawling beast, and like all crowds it had a dynamic of its own. Some coordinated organization was at work because the gathering of hundreds of men was swelled by hundreds more until over 1,000 had assembled, and before long the sheer weight of numbers became intimidating. Why were they here? The functionary wondered anxiously, and the guards beside him palpitated in fear. Although they were commissioned to guard the temple, as mere Gathkaris, these men would not have felt that they could presume to interfere with or lay supercilious hands upon honoured Akrani guests. A shiver of anticipation swept through the mob. The regimental sergeants, the Charvash, came to the front of their surly comrades, and this brought the whole motley crew into a sense of common purpose, for like a flock of birds changing direction in flight, they suddenly stalked up to the gate with the clear intention of entering. Their goal in doing so, whether plunder or whatever else, was irrelevant to the impiety inherent in the act. It would be a sacrilegious intrusion for them to enter the temple for any reason. The functionary stood frozen in shock, opened his mouth as if to speak, but both he and the guards were brushed aside. Then they were knocked down and the soldiers began kicking them about for sport. Flesh was torn, blood was spilt, bones were broken, lives were taken. At all 4 gates the men on guard were beaten to death as the whole multitude poured into the temple like bees into a hive. The political ascendancy of the priestesses of Artemis had never been confronted with the reality of unbridled violence. Although their public pronouncements on the subject could have filled a library, indeed it had filled more than one, they had no real understanding of violence at all. The ideological compliance of their menfolk had occurred incrementally, so that outright rebellion had been circumvented. But this slow, incremental control of attitudes and beliefs had not taken place with their honoured guests. These foreigners brought a fresh and uncontaminated perspective to their evaluation of matriarchy. The real butchery began as the first Akrani soldiers came together in the chamber of preparations with the Gathkari male acolytes, who fled in terror at the unspeakability, the unthinkability of what was happening, but whose escape merely led them into the arms of more Akrani who were filling the outer temple from all sides and blocking all exits. Running futilely in blind panic, the Gathkaris were hewn down and cut to pieces. A shrill feminine screaming erupted as the blood-splattered crowd of soldiers discharged itself through the various doorways into the chamber of solicitude of the inner temple. Most of the priestesses never left the temple and had no personal experience of men. They viewed males solely in terms of the received wisdom of the religious dogmas in their sacred texts. Consequently, to them men were subhuman brutes that instilled an extreme horror and repugnance in any priestess who permitted her thoughts to stray onto unholy things. The sight of moustached and bearded Akrani in their crimson and yellow ochre, their saffron knives drawn and gleaming, running into this sanctum of female sublimity, in direct violation of the consecrated and the sanctified, was to these women a vision of the end of the world. This was Armageddon visited upon the earth. Fleeing inwards, deeper into the temple, they retreated in squealing terror into the palace of love and adoration, finding it inconceivable that the intruders would dare to follow them into this vessel of the supreme woman. Surely no creature, no matter how degenerate and decadent, could possibly be so vile as to break so imperishable a taboo. The coven of priestesses already within the palace, after 36 hours of continual song in their pious petition to the Almighty, were in a condition of total exhaustion. The dancing novices were near to fainting with fatigue. Initially they could make nothing of the noisy influx of their sisters wailing in such extreme distress and fear. Then, beyond these startled, terrified women, they saw the defilement of their temple by the presence of those that the blessed lunar goddess had decreed were unworthy. The Akrani had always heard that the priestesses of Artemis worshipped naked, except for a veil, and now as they romped eagerly into one of the temples of this bizarre cult of matriarchy, they discovered that it was true. More than 300 fancies, from the youthful novices, not yet out of their teens, to the haughty elders who had spent half a century within these walls, all were resplendently female, as any with eyes could see.